Well, thanks everyone for coming. The front seats are almost full by default, so eventually if anybody comes late, we'll have to take one of the front seats now. My name is Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. At its core, the McFarland Center exists to strengthen the intellectual and moral life of the campus and community. We work in sustained partnership with faculty, students, and visiting scholars to support research, teaching, and public inquiry on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, and to foster deeper understanding of of religions and ethical traditions in global contexts. Through faculty seminars, research fellowships, collaborative projects, and sustained initiatives, we seek to build an enduring scholarly community, one that connects individual work to larger institutional and global conversations. This evening's lecture speaks very much to that mission by inviting us to reflect on one of the most powerful concepts in contemporary moral and political discourse, on dignity. Dignity is a concept invoked across many domains: law, activism, philosophy, and Catholic social thought, among others. It's frequently used to defend human rights, guide ethical reflection, and shape debates about justice and public policy. Oops. Yet the meaning of dignity is often assumed rather than examined. In many philosophical traditions, dignity is treated as an inherent human quality or universal moral status. Vincent Lloyd, our speaker today, invites us to reconsider that assumption. For Lloyd, dignity is not simply something people possess. Rather, dignity appears in struggle and the practices of communities resisting domination and insisting on justice. Taking these struggles seriously, he argues, can reshape how we understand dignity itself and how it operates within moral reasoning, political life, and public debate. Vincent Lloyd has been one of the leading voices advancing our rethinking of dignity in contemporary theology and political thought, drawing on examples from movements challenging mass incarceration and from the Black justice movements. Professor Lloyd explores how struggles for freedom and recognition illuminate new ways of understanding dignity and its role in shaping ethical and political life. Vincent is professor of theology and religious studies and director of the Center for Political Theology at Villanova University. His research examines the intersections of religion, politics, and race, with particular attention to how religious ideas animate struggles for social justice and social transformation. He's the author of numerous books, including Black Dignity, The Struggle Against Domination, and with Justin Dubler, Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons. Tonight's lecture is made possible by the Deitchman family Lectures on Religion and Modernity. We're grateful to John Deitchman of the class of 1970 and his family for their support, and I'm also especially grateful to Professor Jacques Linder for initiating the event that we have today. So please join me in welcoming Vincent Lloyd.
Do you want your phone?
Great.
Thanks so much for the warm welcome, Tom, and thanks to you and the staff, and Jacques, who wears a hat at Villanova as well as a hat at Holy Cross, for welcoming me here today to chilly Massachusetts. When we think about approaching marginalized communities from a theological perspective, and particularly from a Catholic theological perspective, the framework that most often comes to mind is one that is rather confusingly named the preferential option for the poor. And it's upside down. Let's try this. Okay. Shall we try this? Okay, thanks. The preferential option for the poor. The idea here, in its most basic, is that when we're looking out about the world, thinking about where our ethical obligations are, we should start with the most marginalized, the poor in a broad sense, those who are suffering or oppressed in some way. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops puts the point this way: the preferential option for the poor restates the biblical lesson that we shall be judged by our response to the least among us, that the quality of justice is best measured by how the poor and most vulnerable are faring. You can see they draw on biblical and traditional resources to put forward this argument. You can also see that this is very much a kind of charity framework, right? It's giving to those who are beneath us. And one of the things that I've been intrigued by is thinking about how we ethicists can move beyond a charity framework, not only to a justice framework, but one that takes social movements and social organizing as primary sites of ethical inquiry. And sometimes it felt like this was a kind of lonely project within a Catholic theological world or a broadly Christian theological world until a Villanova alumnus was elected to the papacy in De Lexite last year. Pope Leo began working with the language of the preferential option for the poor and pushing it in what strikes me as really evocative and productive directions. So in this papal exhortation, Leo says, first here, one aspect of the option for the poor is that we must constantly keep in mind is that it demands of us an attitude of attentiveness to others. So here we're moving from giving things, charity to those who are marginalized, to attending to those who are marginalized. And attending implies not thinking that we know what to give, but also that we need to listen, learn, and respond, and perhaps be in a relationship of responsiveness. So this seems like one move in a good direction, but there's more. Leo continues, in a different part of this exhortation, I express my heartfelt gratitude to all those who have chosen to live among the poor, not merely to pay them an occasional visit, but to live with them as they do. Now it seems as if the imperative, or the ethical imperative, perhaps obligatory or supererogatory, is one not only of giving things, but also of living in community with those who are marginalized. Right? This seems like again, very evocative and two steps beyond what the U.S. Catholic bishops have been talking about in the preferential option for the poor. And then Leo continues, for Christians, the poor are not a sociological category, but the very flesh of Christ. It is not enough to profess the doctrine of God's incarnation in general terms. To enter truly into this great mystery, we need to understand clearly that the Lord took on a flesh that hungers and thirsts and experiences infirmity and imprisonment. So now it seems as if it's not just attending, it's not just joining, but actually there might be privileged access to the divine found among the poor and marginalized, right? Not just a sociological category, but a theological category, and a privileged one. So this seems even more evocative, and one that I think calls us as ethicists or Christian ethicists to rethink our methods when we're doing ethical inquiry. Part of the imperative that Leo draws from this framing is that we must be listening to popular movements, not only what ethicists based in universities are saying, not only what priests are saying, but what the movements of the people are saying. So this, again, seems like something we should sit with and try and figure out how to respond to. In general, it seems like there's a movement from a charity framework to one that's focused on what we might call an epistemic privilege of the oppressed, a kind of knowing that happens among oppressed and marginalized communities that gets at truth, goodness, and beauty in a way that might not otherwise be accessible. So this is a kind of framework that I take to my work. And in earlier work, I was thinking about this sort of approach in terms of natural law. So we're often familiar with a letter from Birmingham jail where Martin Luther King appeals to God's law, higher law, and various other resources, naming the Catholic natural law tradition as one that fuels the fight for integration, the fight to end segregation that King was leading. But King also, as one reads more widely in King's work, King also, from his youth, was thinking with the natural law tradition. He was exploring its implications for economic justice. He was exploring the different ways in which we move from reflection on our own selves to principles about the world, how that happens collectively, how that draws on the emotions, not just reason. So it's not just one thinker in a room figuring out what the natural law is that we need to follow, but rather a collective in movement, right, that is discerning natural law together. And King here, I think, is part of a longer tradition of people like Frederick Douglass and Anna Julia Cooper, who are drawing on natural law in a way that shifts how we, in a sort of Christian academic ethical space, might think about this core category. But when I was doing this work on natural law a decade or so ago, it was also a rather sad story. It once seemed as if natural law was a category that was animating racial justice movements in the US, and then it stopped. And those movements also seemed to fizzle. Right? After the 1970s, language of natural law drops out. There's a more secular rhetoric. It also seems like the energy behind racial justice movements peters out. But of course, we ought not be nostalgic, and we can't hope for what once was to return and save the day. So it was a bit uncertain what was to happen. And this earlier work I did ended on a kind of sad note, right? It seems like the old system has failed. It's not clear what comes next. Then history moved forward, right? The movement for Black Lives, with the response to the killing of Trayvon Martin and many others, was an animating force of black justice movements in the US. And it was not a movement appealing to natural law or God's law or higher law or anything like that. And in fact, some commentators described the movement for Black Lives, movement around Black Lives Matter, as an unchurched movement, a movement that had moved away from the preacher leading the crowd, the image that we have with King, and now is a secular movement. But looking at the platform that the movement for Black Lives put forward, we find some intriguing language. The very first sentence of the platform of the movement for Black Lives says, "Black humanity and dignity requires black political will and power." So I had thought that the kind of language, theological language that might be animating a justice movement was one that would talk about God's law, but here there's not language of God's law, there's language of dignity. So it made me think, what's going on with this language of dignity? Is there something that we, Christian ethicists, can learn about the way we talk about dignity from listening to a racial justice movement that is centering dignity, that is taking dignity as its animating principle? Not only in the platform, but in the self-reporting of the movement. We have these three women, Alicia Garza, Opal Tomedi, and Patrice Cullors, who coined the phrase Black Lives Matter, the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and helped it to circulate, built the infrastructure that originally accelerated its circulation. And when they're recording what their original purpose was when they were building this movement, they say, when we say Black Lives Matter, we are talking about the ways in which black people are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. So I wondered, what if we focus on this sense of dignity? Might there be a tradition of reflection on dignity in black justice movements that might parallel that tradition of reflection on natural law in black justice movements, but also have different features? Might there be new ways of conceptualizing dignity that we can learn when we attend to movements like this? So that seemed promising, but then I started trying to listen to where we see the language of dignity in the world around us. And it's in lots of different sorts of places, right? Which seems like, in some ways, a good thing, right? Dignity is a powerful language. It circulates broadly. It does a lot of different work. It also is very confusing, right? So on the one hand, we have dignity evoked in immigration, refugee context here. This is a protest. We have in the center, this is a Lakota statue 50 feet tall in South Dakota named Dignity, representing the Lakota relationship with the natural world. Pope Francis, in his famous encyclical Laudato Si, also sort of using and centering the language of human dignity for quite different purposes than the Lakota are. And then here we have a U.S. Supreme Court case being argued in Obergefell, the case that legalized same-sex marriage. Dignity was at the very center of the justices' ruling. So if dignity is circulating in all these different places, all these different corners of our world, can it really do much work? Right? If it means so many different things to so many different people, is it just adding oomph to the kind of political points we want to make? Well, the sort of methodology that I think can help us sort through this kind of messy context is one that, again, I think is sort of aligned with the de L'Exité, the Leo's framework there of the preferential option for the poor, one that starts from below. So we might want to think about authoritative documents that say this is what dignity is. That might be one starting point. We might want to start with ordinary language, sort of listening for how people use the language of dignity. So those would be common starting points in theology or philosophy. And the U.S. Catholic bishops have things to say about what dignity is. They say the Catholic Church proclaims that human life is sacred and that dignity of all of the human person is a foundation of a moral vision for society. We believe that every person is precious, that people are more important than things, and that the measure of every institution is whether it threatens or enhances the life and dignity of the human person. Right. So those are conventional approaches, starting with authoritative documents or ordinary language. Another approach might be to start with the language that we hear around us, but not the language we hear anywhere, but the language we hear in marginalized communities, in social movements, in what Pope Leo, following Francis, calls popular movements. And if we start with that kind of language, the language that's growing out of the experience of social movements, we can then put that language in dialogue with authoritative documents, with what the Catholic bishops are saying, and see what happens. See if there are echoes of what the Catholic bishops are saying, if what popular movements are saying puts pressure on what the Catholic bishops are saying. That's a kind of dialectical process that is animating how I'm trying to think about dignity here. Now, the standard story that historians of intellectual life give with respect to dignity is one that marks a transformation. Once, before modernity, dignity meant high status, it meant aristocracy, it meant nobility, it meant maybe a bishop or a judge would have dignity. That's a sense that we still have, that we still maintain when we think of the dignity of a duke or something like that, or a king, although that's not the main sense of dignity that we use now. In modernity, according to the story put forward by Jeremy Waldron and other political philosophers and historians of political thought, in modernity, dignity became an aspect of everyone. It became something about inherent worth, something that can provide a foundation for democratic polities. So from a select few to many. In a sort of technical term, a transvaluation of values. What once was honor, high rank, or nobility is now seen as, those same attributes are seen in everyone. Each of us, deep down, has something that deserves honor. Each of us has something noble in us, in our soul, in ourself, something like this. Right? This sense of dignity we still use and is a widely used sense. Sometimes it's attributed to Christianity, going back 2,000 years. In fact, right, the sense of human dignity is one that comes about with modernity, even if there are antecedents that that one can point to in the Christian tradition and in Scripture. There's not a continuous history of Christian thinkers talking about dignity in this sense. So, knowing that this is a standard story, I was curious, if we look at the African American community in the US in the 19th, 20th century, are we going to find the language of dignity in these two ways? So I had an undergraduate research assistant, and we worked together going through databases of African American newspapers that were widely circulated and read in the 19th and 20th century, and just doing word searches for dignity to see how, right, in this sort of vernacular space of a marginalized community, the language of dignity was used. Is it used in, sense one, or sense two, or something else? And we did find it used in sense one, and we did find it used in sense two, but we also found another sense of dignity that isn't represented well by either one or two, either the pre-modern or the modern account of dignity. And that's one that was intriguing, promising, that seemed like it held potential to inflect the way that Christian ethicists speak about dignity. So one approach would be to look at all those different examples of newspaper texts. Another would be to look at sort of canonical works that invoke this other sense of dignity. And the most famous sort of canonical work that invokes this other sense of dignity, a third sense of dignity, comes from Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass, I'm sure you know, born in slavery, escaped, wrote a story of his life, actually iterated a story of his life three times. And at the center of each of those three books about his life, about his journey from slavery to freedom, is an encounter with Edward Covey, with a man, a slave breaker who was tasked with whipping Douglass, with sort of breaking the will of Douglass, because Douglass was seen as rebellious. So this is the centerpiece of the story, the turning point where Douglass once had one sort of life and now is going to have a different sort of life. And this is how Douglass describes that turning point. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my life as a slave. It rekindled in my breast the smoldering embers of liberty. It brought up my Baltimore dreams and revived a sense of my own manhood. I was a changed being after that fight. I was nothing before. I was a man now. It recalled to life my crushed self-respect and my self-confidence and inspired me with a renewed determination to be a free man. A man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity. Now, this seems really intriguing, without the essential dignity of humanity. This seems quite different from both of those two earlier senses, because it seems like not everyone has this sense of dignity. Some people have it and some people don't, if you can be without it. It also comes about with force, right? It's not from an office. It's not from being an aristocrat, being born into this high status role. It's not by being appointed a judge or being, in some respected profession. It is through struggling, right? Through struggling to become oneself, to be free of the slave breaker, Covey, that dignity is realized. So that got me thinking, this seems like it is worth developing, and it also seems like it resonates with what we're seeing in the Black Lives Matter space, where in that social movement space, in that popular movement space, it seems as if dignity also has to do with struggle against anti-blackness, with struggle against forms of white supremacy as that movement was understanding them. Perhaps there's a continuous tradition here. Maybe there's a world of ideas that we can fill out. Just to fill out some details with some more language, what we see going on in this fight with Covey, we see Edward Covey has something like a will to dominate, to become a god, to occupy the role that a god is supposed to have, to impose his will on Douglass. There's a struggle which has both mental and physical components. Douglass is not only grappling bodily, but also using his wits, also gathering comrades, fellow enslaved people, also representing the struggle in an aesthetically pleasing way, Right? All of this seems like it's part of the struggle that is important to that framing of dignity. And it seems like there's something compounding here. The more he struggles in this account, in the account Douglas gives us, the more he's motivated for struggle. He struggles, he actualizes his dignity. The more his dignity is actualized, the more he struggles against domination. There's a sort of snowballing effect here. It seems like his humanity is being realized against false gods. Like there's a contrast between Covey presenting himself as godlike and Douglas is subordinate, whereas Douglas is realizing that we need to denounce false gods. Dignity is unevenly distributed here. Some have more. The more one struggles, the more one has. And it also seems as if, in Douglas's view, Douglas ultimately has dignity. Covey ultimately doesn't. So it seems as if we're getting a third concept of dignity start to develop here. Not honor, high rank, or nobility, and not shared humanity, equality, or inherent worth, but something else, which we might call dignity through struggle, just to borrow the framing, the words that grow out of Douglas's account. Here, in this framing, right, we have Douglas physically struggling, he's grappling, he's using his hands, his force, his muscle against Covey in this encapsulation of what dignity through struggle could be. But we can think of struggle in a broad range of contexts. And when we're thinking about social movements, movements like Black Lives Matter, movements like prison abolition movements, there are all sorts of things that struggle involves. Artistic forms of struggle, helping people imagine in new ways against the limited imagination that forces of domination put forward. Intellectual forms of struggle, shaping new ideas, critiquing ideas that are serving the interests of the wealthy and powerful, and so on. One might even see prayer, silence as forms of struggle, and organizing, which often doesn't feel like struggle. If you're finding fellow workers, if you're finding fellows who share an experience of marginalization or oppression and speaking out loud, those forms of oppression that you share, making plans, gathering others around you, that work of organizing may seem very different from the sort of physical struggle that Douglas depicts, and yet still seems to count as struggle, still would seem to count in this category of dignity through struggle. Now, not to get into too much sort of technical or quasi-technical detail, but I think if we want to figure out how dignity through struggle relates to these two other concepts of dignity, we might think of them as moving from a two-dimensional to a three-dimensional sense of dignity. So the first two accounts of dignity, the honor, high rank, nobility, equality, inherent worth, both are kind of status at a moment of time, moment in time. This is the dignity that each person has at one moment in time. Everyone has equal dignity, for example, because it's inherent worth. Or you can sort of check what rank each person is and then apportion their dignity according to that rank. But this dignity through struggle, I want to suggest in this sort of sketchy way, is something that's happening in time. It's performed, something that one does, process, and it might look, if you're taking a snapshot in time, like either honor, high rank, nobility, or equality or inherent worth. But if you look at it over time, in the work of a popular movement or social movement, as that movement moves dialectically forward as it confronts forces of domination, then you see this three-dimensional nature of dignity emerge. So to offer another couple of examples that get at another aspect of dignity, this three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional, and we'll add another aspect shortly. We might think of Langston Hughes, the famous African-American poet, who has this poem, August 19th. This is the date of the execution of the Scottsboro Boys, these a group of young men who were wrongly accused of harassing a white woman in the South, sentenced to death. This Langston Hughes poem says, August 19th is the date, thunder in the sky, in Alabama, a young boy will die. August 19th is the date, judges in high places still preserve their dignity and dispose of cases. So here it seems as if Hughes is sort of teasing us with a sense of dignity. He says, people talk about dignity in this hollow way. People say that judges have dignity, but when we present a context, when we see the world in motion, see, it rings hollow. It seems like there's something deeply false about ascribing dignity to these judges who are ultimately killing a boy. But Hughes also uses dignity in a quite different context, in a different poem, one that is in motion. So in this poem, Harlem Dance Hall, which is describing exactly what the title says, he writes, it had no dignity before, but when the band began to play, suddenly the earth was there, and flowers, trees, and air, and like a wave, the floor that had no dignity before. So this seems intriguing again, right? It seems like there was no dignity, and then there was dignity, right? And this dignity is in bodies in motion, dancing, moving to music, and harmonized with the land, with the flowers, the trees, the ecology. That there's something that's the opposite of that false dignity of the judge that Hughes is pointing to in the dance hall, and that strikes us strikes him, and he's trying to elicit an intuition from us that this is actually capturing something much truer, much deeper about dignity than the judge's dignity. So this points to another way in which this account of dignity, as we found in Douglas, as we found in Black Lives Matter, and as I'm trying to reconstruct in this tradition of black justice movements, another aspect of this account of black dignity, which is that it involves a process of discerning false copies, right? That we're often encountering the language of dignity, and we're invited to see, right, what's wrong with it. We're invited to discern, to attend to what it's getting wrong, and what that broader context can help us see about challenges of justice. So it's an ongoing process, an iterative process, a collective process, and a holistic process, not just flattening into that two-dimensional, one moment in time accounting of who has dignity and who doesn't, but looking, seeing what that gets wrong, looking over time, looking over space, and so on, as Hughes in his aesthetic register invites us to do. One more example before doing a little bit, stepping back and doing a little bit more ethical analysis. We might think of Paul Robeson, right? This outstanding 19th century black American figure who was a football player, a star football player, was a singer whose voice inspired many in the U.S. and beyond. He traveled internationally. He learned many languages, so he could sing in those languages, and also an activist. So Robeson used the language of dignity and was described as having dignity in these different contexts. So if we want to attend to dignity in this three-dimensional way that looks at it over time in context through, for example, the story of a life, we might turn to Robeson. And Robeson, too, was engaging with and challenging and redeploying the language of dignity he found around him. So that the language of dignity starts to circulate broadly in the international human rights regime with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter in the mid-20th century. And Robeson and his colleagues and comrades heard that language and said, it's missing out on something in the U.S., right? There are indignities that are being suffered by African Americans that the United Nations ought to pay attention to. So in this petition that Robeson offered called We Charge Genocide. He said, many of your petitioners are Negro citizens to whom the charges herein described are not mere words. They are facts felt on our bodies, crimes inflicted on our dignity. So in a sense, this sounds like maybe it's the inherent worth sense of dignity if we were just to take this snapshot alone. It seems like Robeson is appealing to a modern account of dignity. But he's doing it strategically, right? He knows this is a language that the United Nations can hear. This is a language that can get him and his movement what is needed. So if we zoom out and think about context, think about change over time, we can see Robeson using more complex ways of dignity that are, more complex accounts of dignity that are condensed here at this moment. Robeson describes his father in his autobiography as having dignity as his father stood up against the forms of racism that his father was encountering. His father was a Presbyterian minister who had all sorts of challenges, even though he was a leading light of his community. And Robeson, as he was going about wearing his activist hat, was also using the language of dignity. Right? He described a so-called lowly station in life was no bar to a man's assertion of his full human dignity. So here, this sense of assertion, I think, evokes a sense of struggle again. If we're thinking about this three-dimensional sense, dignity in time, dignity is something that's performed. Dignity is something that Robeson does when he's on stage, when he's in the United Nations, when he's working, wearing his organizer hat with communities in struggle. This is all, these are all things we should attend to when we're thinking about dignity properly, not in that flattened sense. Now, if we want to think in a little bit more technical, moral, theological terms about dignity, here's one sort of path that we might go on. So we, in this sort of Christian ethics world, like to think about the human as imaging God in some way, right? There's some aspect of God that is reflected in each of us, each human being. Exactly what this means is a little bit mysterious, but maybe that's proper, right? God is a bit mysterious. No human concepts are rightly reflective of God, only imperfectly. So if we're going to talk about the way that God is imaged in our humanity, we should also leave a bit of a mystery. God resists human representation, and so there must be something about our humanity that resists human representation. The world, so to speak, right? These sort of when we're talking with each other, when we're reading the laws, when we're dealing with bureaucracies, when we are dealing with institutions, the world wants to make representation seem successful, right? It wants to make it seem as if humans can be properly classified, that there's no mystery in our humanity. That is, that the image of God is not present in the workings of those institutions. And yet, we have a feeling, we have an intuition, and we have experience that we're always being misrepresented, right? By others, by institutions, by languages. There's always something about us, right? About our humanity that sort of slips away. There's some friction between our humanity and the world, right? That friction seeming to mark that mystery of the image of God in us. Right? So if that's the case, then this account of dignity that I'm suggesting we think with might be one that leans into that friction, right? That friction between our humanity and the world. That says, if we pay attention to, if we work with, if we bring out that sense of ourselves that slips away from the world, right? Which means fighting with the world, right? Which means struggling against the institutions of the world, which means struggling against the habits, the concepts that would purport to properly represent our humanity. That's where dignity is being realized. It's in that process of leaning into the friction between our humanity and the world. Right, so that's a kind of loose sketch of what we might think about. And it's a sketch that has deep theological antecedents. I'll point to one of them, and the distance here I also want to remember from starting with Black Lives Matter, very contemporary, use of language in social movements, popular movements, and now we'll think briefly with St. Augustine. I teach at an Augustinian Catholic university, so we're required to have some slides on Augustine and whatever we do. St. Augustine, who I'm sure you're familiar with, also African father of the church, although his Africanness is not always remembered at my employer. Augustine had a lot to say about the state, about the citizenship, about the self. If you read the Confessions, if you read A City of God, sometimes it can seem as if these are different, he has these many different projects that don't fit together so neatly. If he's talking about virtues of citizenship, if he's talking about, if he's being read as a sort of conservative or realist theorist of the state, if he's being read as someone talking about the image of God in the human in the Confessions, these are often in the scholarship treated as separate. I want to suggest that if we think about the will to dominate, libido dominandi, they're a way to think about these different things tied together. So if we think of the human as essentially a bundle of loves, which is a sort of Augustine formulation, loves can be rightly ordered or disordered. When they're rightly ordered, they're pulled in the direction of God. When they're more rightly ordered, they're pulled in the direction of God. When they're disordered, they're pulled in the direction of pride, which is a sort of form of idolatry, thinking, worshiping something that is not God, worshiping oneself, or worshiping state institutions, or whatever it is in the world that one might want or lust after. This is operating in the self and animating politics. So in the Confessions, right, Augustine is thinking about the will to dominate as something that he experiences very personally. In the City of God, Augustine is thinking about the will to dominate as something that we experience collectively at the level of a state, right? Trying to dominate other states, an empire trying to dominate other empires, a politician trying to dominate others around. We get various textual evidence of this from Augustine, which I'll just skip over. And, right, if we think about this libido dominandi, this will to dominate, as unifying the personal and the state level in Augustine, right, the flip side of that, right, is the struggle between these two wills, right, the will to dominate and the will that's oriented toward God. What Augustine seems to be urging us is to participate in this struggle, right, to not sort of let our will be disordered, and instead to turn away from false gods, right? Turn away from the will to dominate and toward God. That involves identifying the will to dominate. It involves correcting, again, in a sort of iterative process. You see in the Confessions, trying, getting it wrong, trying again, figuring out what's going on, that sort of iterative process to correct the will to dominate. And it involves a struggle that is never ending, given the cyculum that is a sort of status of the world between times where there's good and bad mixed together. And indeed, it seems, reading somewhat strongly, that we participate in God through struggle, right? This process of working through ourselves individually and collectively to orient ourselves toward God is how we're participating in God. And right here again, we've sort of routed through Augustine, got to something like an account of dignity through struggle, the image of God realizing in the human as struggling against the will to dominate, struggling against collective forms of domination. Augustine dramatizes this when he turns to telling the story of the Garden of Eden, right? We're persuaded to sin through pride, through thinking ourselves a god. We love to access Adam and Eve love to access their own power. Their loves are misdirected. They desire to become gods. And this is something from which we can learn from. In other words, for Augustine, what's happening in Eden seems very much like what Douglas is depicting in his struggle with Covey, right? There are the paradigm cases of struggle where there's someone who tries to dominate, someone who thinks himself a god, who's trying to impose his will on the world, and a struggle against that. And through that struggle, the possibility for right relationship with God, for realization of dignity. At least that's, it seems like there's something evocative there in their use of these paradigm cases. When, so to sort of move more directly from Augustine to Douglas, it does seem at first as if the libido dominandi that we're familiar with from Augustine's Confessions is a very personal kind of thing, even if he talks about the Roman Empire having a will to dominate or it happening at a small scale. It's most acutely felt, our intuitions are strongest when it's at this sort of personal level. But I think it through scholarship in Black studies and other critical social theory fields in recent years, we've been thinking in careful ways about the ways in which a will to dominate at this micro level, for example, between slave master and enslaved, right? That laboratory condition of examination of domination actually flows into structures of domination, right? When we think about like structural racism, sometimes it can seem like a very opaque and sort of hand-wavy kind of phenomenon, but if we think of this original scene, this primal scene of domination, master and enslaved, one with a will to assert over the other, as Douglas dramatizes, and that being possible, right, because of ideas that are circulating, because of habits, because of laws, because of institutions. Right? There's an apparatus that makes it so that Covey thinks himself a god with respect to Douglas. Cutting channels in the world, so to speak, cutting pathways in the world from that all sort of flow through in the afterlives of slavery. This is a claim that Black studies scholars have very powerfully made, I think, in the last decade or so, in tandem with social movement organizing, to say we think slavery is just a historical phenomenon, but if we think about the paths through the world that it cut, right? If we think about the way in which these institutions, habits, concepts continue to circulate, we can see the continuing force that it still has. And when we do that, we can think about that force of the paradigm case, the force of Douglas and Covey, the force of Adam and Eve, the force of Augustine wrestling with himself, being things that we can confront when we're facing forms of domination at a large scale in our current world, like in the movement for Black Lives, where anti-blackness is named as a force of domination that is existing in the present world. And it also provides a check, right? It provides a means of critical judgment, right? If there is a social movement that is alleging that it is confronting domination, or it is saying things about its orientation, we can ask, can that be tracked back to a primal scene of domination? Can be tracked back to something like that fight between Douglas and Covey? There's a orienting function that this mode of thinking offers. We also get, I think here, both elements of equality and nobility when dignity is understood in this way, drawing on both Douglas and Augustine and the broader sort of social movement discourse. Right? On the one hand, there is domination and struggle everywhere, right? All of us in different aspects of our lives dominate and are dominated. All of us in different aspects of our lives struggle and don't struggle, right? Sort of accede. This is part of the human condition, even though right, it's not these proportions are not evenly distributed, right? There are some who are acutely in situations of domination, others who are not. And yet, in some aspects of our life, we all are. So that element of equality, that we all have dignity in some way, seems to be preserved when dignity is understood in this way. But we also get this variation in quantity, as I'm suggesting. Now, I want to say just one thing as I'm moving toward the end about why blackness, right, which I think can be a kind of controversial term, I want to preserve here in associating with this account of dignity, right? If dignity is just this structure of struggle that I'm describing, one that Augustine experienced, one that is experienced at a broad scale, why call it black? Well, isn't this distracting? Isn't this provincializing? Isn't this making us think about some people and not others? Well, first I think there's something powerfully evocative about it, and I think this tradition that goes from Augustine the African to Douglas as an African American to the movement for Black Lives is reconstructing something that is worth thinking with. But also, I think we should resist thinking too simply in too simple terms about what is blackness, right? To thinking about it as a color, as genetics, as a culture, or something along those lines, something that can be very easily sort of described or checked off a box. There are traditions in South Africa, in the US, and around the world of thinking about blackness as a political category, as one that directs our attention to a paradigm case of domination, right? If blackness has something to do with this paradigm case of slavery and its afterlives, its continuing force. And in even the Western tradition, right, slavery is the paradigm case of domination. If you read modern political philosophers or medievals or whoever you want to read, right? Think about domination, think about slavery. Where is slavery in its most acute form? Right, in the Middle Passage, where everything is stripped from the enslaved in the process of enslavement. It seems like that, drawing our attention to that paradigm case through the language of blackness may be productive here. So what are the lessons that I think we should draw from this sort of analysis, from telling these sorts of stories? One, going back to the very beginning, to Leo's sort of call to further or move beyond charity framings of the preferential option for the poor. Whatever sort of work we're doing, whatever sort of analysis we're doing, taking seriously the epistemic privilege of the marginalized, right? That conceptual work can be done, right? Can be instigated by attending to the marginalized communities, not just figuring out how can we help them, but how can they shift the ideas that we use to organize our world. I think often in contexts like those I've been talking about, there's a tendency to think about groups, right? What does this group need? How is this group demanding their rights? And instead, this framework, again, following the language of Leo, is one that is attending to popular movements and the wisdom embedded in popular movements. And I think that's a lesson that Christian ethicists more broadly ought to take heed of. And finally, I think there can be a tendency to think about, especially these days, questions of race in terms of identity, and identity as something deeply personal. It's something that I see myself as, a box that I check, a community that I gather of affiliates. And the sorts of examples that I'm offering here are gathering those who share in traditions of struggle, right? Share in traditions of struggle against white supremacy or against slavery and its afterlives. And that tradition of struggle is constitutive of identity rather than a label or a box that's checked, which also seems really rich for us to continue thinking about as we're navigating these fraught political waters. Thank you so much for your attention. Hmm?
What's the best first question?
Yes?
Could you speak up?
Thanks. Yeah. So I mentioned that an undergraduate research assistant and I went through a bunch of African American newspaper sort of clippings. We used some digital databases, which was really productive as a starting point for doing some conceptual analysis and just for getting us, sometimes when you're dealing with a world of ideas, right, you can float away from the complexity of reality, the complexity of particular situations, and the complexity of how people talk, right? People aren't very precise in how they talk about concepts that matter to them. And remembering that and figuring out how to deal with that seems important. So that was one method that I used. And yeah, I mean, I think it was important to me to see popular movements as things that speak in many voices, right? So there are not sort of single leaders, even if we identify Martin Luther King as a leader of the civil rights movement. Right? There are all sorts of people, right? Ella Baker and many others who are sort of working behind the scenes to make a movement what it is, not only at a kind of concrete level, like making the flyers and stuff, but also at the level of ideas, shaping the imagination and the conceptual world that accompanies popular movements. So that that variety of voices and sort of working through and lifting up the variety of voices, whether they're poets like Langston Hughes, whether they're singers and actors like Paul Robeson, or whether they're writers and activists like Frederick Douglass. That movement between styles seems, struck me as essential. Yes. Mm. 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 Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. So the example of I'm just trying to pick it up here. So in the case of Frederick Douglass, in the way that Douglass tells this story, Douglass is being attacked by Covey, a slave breaker who tries to bind his hands and feet and then whip him. And Douglass describes his actions, at the surface of the text, he describes his actions as defensive. He says, so I'm not sure if he would characterize it as violent or not. There's physical struggle, but the physical struggle is one that is sort of defensive so that he's not sort of captured by and attacked by Covey. The language of violence, Jacques and I have just been working on a paper about the complexities of the language of violence and the way that it gets used in lots of different ways in lots of different contexts. I mean, I think the sense of physical struggle very much it does seem central to Douglass's vision. But I think Douglass here is giving us a quite one case, which he treats as a paradigm case, and a quite narrow one, right, at that. So if we think of the many things that struggle could include, right, we have the artistic struggle, intellectual struggle, prayer, silence, organizing. These all seem like they fit. If we're identifying false gods and we're trying to, demystify them and trying to attend to the part of our humanity that is not sort of captured by the world, right? All of these seem like strategies that do that. All of these seem like means of struggle in that respect. And even right, in the Langston Hughes poem, right, the sort of struggle, the Harlem Dance Hall poem, the kind of dignity that we get, at first seems like it's not struggle at all. It's a dance hall, right? It's dancing to music. How can that be struggle? But right, if we think of Harlem in the early 20th century, right, where there's a sort of the dance hall provides an oasis from forms of police violence and and abuse of other sorts that the black community is experiencing, and the sort of sense of attending to one's humanity that happens when one is moving to music, right, with one's fellows, right. There's something that I think does qualify as struggle, right, even in this context of dancing. Thanks. Yes.
What would you say are kind of the discrepancies of dignity in this kind of conception with free will? To some extent, it seems like this version of dignity is like just the behavioral name for the process of enacting free will.
Thanks. Yeah. So, and free will is I want to say knotty, like a sort of a complex concept, right? Different accounts that people give, and often the ones that are sort of will. Yeah. So is it just asserting will? So I've been thinking about this in a different context recently, where I've been doing a little bit more work in what people call sort of Christian doctrine or systematic theology. And one of the challenges with that area is, one of the challenges with theology is that the task of theology is to say true words about God, and also, right, we can't say true words about God, right? All of our words fail when we speak about God. We're tempted to say things about God willing, and about the relationship between God's willing and human willing, but that is already attributing to God a human concept, right? Because we're thinking about God as a kind of creature who wills in the way that we think of ourselves as a creature who wills. So that is already getting messy. Whether we ourselves are creatures who will, what that means when we're shaped by different contexts, where there are all sorts of factors that are pressuring us, but also underdetermining what we do, right? Also, kind of messy. So, I think there's a tricky, sort of methodologically tricky point in maintaining mystery, right? Maybe this is too, I'm too deep in the theological commitments here, but for the broader humanities. But it does seem like there is something about the human that we cannot describe well and will never have proper language for. That thing about the human, I don't think is our capacity to will, right? If it were our capacity to will, we could have a name for it, right? So there's a kind of site of failure, a site where language, just doesn't work, right? When we're trying to point at something within ourselves. And so, I'm struggling a bit with the language to say, what does it mean to attend to that site of language's failure? What does it mean to bring out that aspect of us that we actually can't name very well? And I don't think that's willing, because, to will would already be to simplify, right, to make it legible. But there is something going on there, and that sort of friction between the world and us, and accentuating that friction. That's another metaphor, but maybe one that's also getting at that. So those are the directions I'd go in there. Thanks.
All right, let's call it at that. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Thank you.